All right, hello everyone. Welcome to my channel. I'm Thomas. I do videos on educational matters, mostly obscure and esoteric, um, things that people don't know about that I have dug up and trying to polish off and present to you. Today is the 103rd video that we're doing on the reciprocal system of theory of Dewey B. Larson. He was a 20th century engineer and tinkerer, and he discovered the reciprocal system of theory starting way back in 1930 and developed it over the course of the next 60 years until he died in 1990. He wrote maybe 15 books and 50 or so articles on the topic, gave talks all over the place in spite of not really getting any recognition from any of the experts out there, because the experts recognized that they were out of a job if any of this were going to come to light. They would eventually be made fun of and wouldn't be working anymore. So they held on to their old paradigm and shoved Mr. Larson into the scrap heap. But we're trying to dust him off here. We're looking at his final book that is called Beyond Space and Time. And this was his attempt to describe metaphysics, that which is beyond space and time, that which has to do with what he calls Sector 3, or the spiritual, religious, the God world, religion, psychology, philosophy. Whereas his earlier books were all on the hard sciences like chemistry and physics. Now, the basic idea behind his theory is that the universe is made out of motion. Motion is the relationship between time and space. Time and space are merely co-inhabitors of motion. They are reciprocals of each other, meaning that 2/3 and 3/2 are reciprocals of each other. They are just inverses of one another. Space and time are inverses of one another. They both come in 3 dimensions or more, and they both progress, meaning that they're getting later and later and later, or they're getting farther and farther and farther apart. And they both are in discrete units, meaning that there is no continuity there. There are, they come in chunks, very small chunks, like smaller than grains of sand, but nonetheless, they are in only discrete units. And it turns out that 1 unit of space in 1 unit of time is the speed of light. And that speed of light, 1/1, is the midpoint of the universe, or the null point, or even the origin of the universe. There is an entire half of the universe that is moving faster than the speed of light. He calls that Sector 2, or the cosmic sector. And then there's the familiar half that is moving slower than the speed of light, which he calls the material sector, or Sector 1. Sector 1 grows by aggregation, bonding, up until its most complicated level, which Larson refers to as DNA. And at that point, DNA becomes eligible to be taken control over by a Sector 2 entity. And that entity together, Sector 1 and Sector 2 combined, in the right proportions, in the right configuration, is what Larson calls the life unit. And so life is a combination of a material and a cosmic body. And then that life unit grows and develops and evolves up until its most complex level, all the way from a single-celled organism all the way up to the intelligent human being. And at that point, the intelligent human being becomes eligible to be controlled overall by a Sector 3 entity, what other people would have called God or the gods or the goddesses or the spiritual or the metaphysical or the numinous or the religious. Larson calls it Sector 3, and it is always good, and it communicates with us in a way to guide us toward ethical behavior or good behavior or just behavior. Now, this sometimes conflicts with Sector 2 because Sector 2 is always guiding us toward survival. Sometimes those are in conflict, and when they are, then our human free will takes over and has to choose between the two. Now, we are in chapter 25 of this book, Beyond Space and Time, Larson's final book. Came out posthumously in 1995. And we are looking at a chapter called Outlook for Communication. So this is about Sector 3 communication with humans. This can come mainly from the metaphysical region, but it can also come from other humans because intelligent humans do have a Sector 3 component. Once they get to that level, then they become eligible to be controlled by Sector 3. So he points out that how telepathy, for example, is communication between two Sector 3, the level 3 of two different individuals, whereas something like intuition or revelation is coming directly from Sector 3 to a human. So he's now talking about these different topics. So we're going to take over here in the middle of this chapter. So here is Larson. If the foregoing conclusions with respect to motivation are correct, they have some significant implications in connection with the efforts that are now being made to study telepathy and other ESP phenomena experimentally. They strongly suggest that the principal obstacle standing in the way of obtaining more satisfactory results is the lack of adequate motivation on the part of the subjects participating in the experiments. Investigators working in the field have already recognized that motivation is an important factor. J.B. Rhine, the guy who runs the Rhine Center over there at Duke University, or at least it's in Durham, North Carolina. J.B. Rhine, for instance, says that in order to produce a suitable test situation for psi, that's PSI, that's psychic measure, an order of interest must be sustained sufficiently high to compete successfully with the many other interests arising out of the subject's own personality and the test's surroundings. The findings of this present investigation suggest that the order of interest envisioned by Rhine is not anywhere near high enough to set the stage for efficient and effective communication. The indications are that competition with other interests cannot be tolerated at all, that the would-be receiver of the message must not only give the matter his full and undivided attention, but must be intensely motivated as well. The problem of how to provide sufficient motivation may be a difficult one, particularly since it is questionable whether any collateral motive, such as the expectation of a substantial financial reward, will suffice. If such a reward would provide adequate motivation, gambling houses would have to go out of business. It is altogether possible, in the light of the findings of our preliminary investigation, that nothing less than an intense desire to accomplish the objective for its own sake is adequate. As pointed out in Chapter 9, gambling, to the extent that chance rather than skill determines the outcome, is an exercise in ESP. The gambler is trying to anticipate what the next roll of the dice, deal of the card, or turn of the wheel will reveal. This is exactly the same thing that the subjects in certain types of ESP experiments are trying to do. The person who breaks the bank at a gambling establishment, or who is prevented from so doing only by arbitrary betting limits or restrictions, is accomplishing the same results as the ESP stars mentioned by John Mann in the statement we quoted in Chapter 8. The individuals whose extraordinary performance in the ESP test is the principal empirical support for the reality of the ESP phenomena. It was noted in the earlier discussion that the general conclusions which can be drawn about the existence and characteristics of ESP from gambling games are identical with those reached by way of specific ESP experiments, as would be expected where the basic process is the same. But the conditions surrounding the attempts to foretell the coming events are quite different in the two cases, and it is these differences that are responsible for the more erratic performances of the gamblers. One significant point is that most gamblers are not trying to anticipate what is going to happen. They are simply placing their bets and hoping that fortune will favor them. These individuals are not exercising their ESP ability, if they have any. Only those who consciously or unconsciously bet on intuition or hunches can be compared to the participant in the regular ESP experiments. Furthermore, since the primary objective in gambling is monetary gain, the direct incentive to foretell future events, which appear to be a requirement for success in clairvoyance, is largely accidental. The person who has an extraordinary run of luck cannot repeat his performance at the next gambling session because the financial gains that he made on the previous occasion are now uppermost in his mind, and he cannot approach the situation with the same attitude that brought his earlier success. The star performer in the ESP experiments is also limited in the extent to which he can repeat his earlier successes, but not to the same degree as the gambler. He can usually maintain a reasonable standard of accomplishment over a considerable period of time. In view of the differences in the experimental conditions, this difference in the results is understandable. The ESP subject is specifically aiming at ESP performance. He knows what he is trying to do. In this case, the ESP objective is not subject to being relegated to a secondary role, as it is in gambling. But even though he may initially have the intense desire to produce positive results that seems to be a prerequisite for success, it is not possible to maintain that high level of motivation indefinitely after the existence of ESP has been demonstrated to his own satisfaction. And no one knows how to proceed any farther. Sooner or later, his interest wanes, and with it goes his ESP capacity. Most of the experimental work thus far undertaken has involved a rather close collaboration between the investigators and the subjects, and it is doubtful if adequate motivation on the part of the subjects has ever been attained, unless the investigators were equally motivated by a strong desire to produce something of a positive nature. Much of the criticism of the ESP experiments has centered on the fact that the positive results come only from the investigators who are personally convinced of the reality of ESP and want to find evidence to support that belief, while the results of experiments carried out by skeptics are uniformly negative. Our findings with respect to motivation now indicate that this is just what should be expected. ESP reception by skeptics or even impartial subjects is impossible. The subjects must be strongly motivated in order to succeed, and such motivation is practically impossible if the investigator in charge of the experiment is a skeptic. On the other hand, the present tendency for the investigators to be biased in favor of positive results is scientifically undesirable. Some redesign of the experiments that will introduce an emotional separation between the investigators and the subjects is therefore very much in order. Inasmuch as it appears that the requirements for a transmitter of telepathic messages are very much more stringent than those of a receiver, the problem of providing qualified transmitters for experimentation is critical. Indeed, the likelihood that any of the persons utilized for transmission purposes in the ESP experiments to date were adequately qualified and sufficiently motivated for the task is so remote that it is probable that telepathy has never actually been examined experimentally. Telepathy is difficult to distinguish from clairvoyance, and it has already been suggested by some observers that all of the current ESP experiments are dealing with clairvoyance, even when telepathy is the ostensible subject of the investigation. Our findings support this conclusion. The difficulty in differentiating between telepathy and clairvoyance in the experimental situations has led to further suggestion that telepathy may not exist at all, and that ESP phenomena are wholly due to clairvoyance. Here, however, we cannot concur. Once it has been demonstrated that Sector 3 communication is a reality, the basic objections that have hitherto been raised to the acceptance of the validity of reports of spontaneous telepathic occurrences are invalidated, and the existence of telepathic process must therefore be recognized. These spontaneous incidents always involve an extraordinary degree of motivation on the part of the individual who must be regarded as the transmitter of the message and no conscious effort by the receiver. This kind of a situation has not thus far been duplicated in the experiments intended to be telepathic. Some extensive study of spontaneous telepathy, together with revelation, extraordinary scientific insight, and other identical extemporaneous intuitive processes ought to be carried out in order to determine the mental and emotional states of the participants, as well as the kind and degree of motivation that is involved. What little attention has been paid to the spontaneous occurrences thus far has been mainly directed toward establishing the reality of the several phenomena in question. But the events in which communication actually did take place, according to our present understanding, are undoubtedly the best sources of information as to the conditions under which transmission and reception of Sector 3 messages is possible. This information as to the necessary conditions for communication must be available before appropriate experiments to enlarge the existing knowledge of the intersector communication processes can be effectively designed and conducted, because these are the conditions that must be duplicated in order to obtain reproducible experimental results. As noted in Chapter 8, much of the criticism of the ESP investigations has centered on the lack of reproducibility of the results. But as matters now stand, no one knows what the conditions relevant to the ESP phenomena actually are, and all of the talk about reproducibility is meaningless. The prevailing inability to reproduce the relevant conditions which surround an ESP experiment applies with equal force when an individual attempts to repeat his own work. The glee with which the critic seize upon the very common decrease in ESP abilities after early success as evidence against the validity of the earlier results is therefore entirely unwarranted. Hansel's caustic comment, quote, "In other words, experimenters failed to confirm their own results," is definitely out of order, since neither Hansel nor the experimenters know how any specific experiment could be duplicated. Neither knows how to set up the equivalent of the non-physical conditions of the original work. Rhine attributes the apparent loss of ESP capacity in repeated experiments to a waning of the initial enthusiasm with which the subjects approached the test. As previously mentioned, this may well be one of the factors, but it is probably not the full explanation. We simply do not know enough about the phenomenon to arrive at firm conclusions. All of this definitely underlines the desirability of some extensive research into the conditions under which ESP and the related phenomena make their appearance. It should be recognized that this basic information is not peculiar to ESP. We are equally deficient in our knowledge of the conditions surrounding all other forms of communication with Sector 3 or through Sector 3 channels. Scientific insight, for instance, is no more reproducible than ESP. We can set up a duplicate of all of the identifiable conditions under which an important scientific idea appeared in a flash of insight, but this will not bring us another important scientific idea. It will not even assure us of the production of an inconsequential new idea. A.C. Benjamin makes this comment concerning our utter inability to create a situation that can be counted on to serve the purpose. Quote, we can say simply that unless the scientist has a firm foundation of extensive factual knowledge, unless he has an overpowering drive, unless he indulges in occasional relaxation, unless he understands something of the logic of explanation, he cannot hope for results. But if he satisfies all of these conditions, he may still not succeed if he lacks the mysterious spark. This is the bitter conclusion to which we are driven. Okay, that's the end of the quote, and I will leave it there. Stop off, and thank you for tuning in. Hope you come back next time to finish off this chapter. Have a great day. Thanks for tuning in.